Hey guys, just a quick thank you to all of you amazing legends that are subscribed. I could not have done it without you. But most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and like this video. It's free and it really helps our small team out. I wasn't looking for anything serious, just someone to chat with and maybe hang out. You know, the usual Tinder, right? Like who even takes that app seriously anymore. But then I came across Amy's profile, and something about it made me swipe right. Not that she looked unreal or anything, she just seemed different in a good way. Her pictures were normal, nothing too fancy, no fake model vibes, but there was something in the way she smiled that felt real. I figured, hey, she's probably just looking for someone to talk to too. At first, it was just a typical small talk, where you try to get a feel for the person without actually saying anything interesting. Her responses were quick but not too eager. But the more we talked, the more I started getting this weird vibe. Like she was too perfect, I guess. The way she answered my questions, the little details she threw in about her life, everything was just a little too tailored. I didn't think much of it at the time. I mean, people like to present their best selves online, right? And maybe I was just overthinking things. After all, we all have our quirks when it comes to first impressions. But something was off. She'd text me at odd hours like 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. But when I'd ask her about it, she'd always have some excuse. Like, oh, I was at work or couldn't sleep. It was the kind of stuff I didn't push on because, honestly, who hasn't gotten weird with timing before? Then came the day she suggested we meet up. I was excited but also kind of nervous. I hadn't met anyone from Tinder in a while, and something about her felt just off. But maybe I was just overthinking it, right? We agreed to meet at this local coffee shop. Nothing fancy. I figured it was a safe place and neutral ground. She gave me the address and said she'd be there in about 30 minutes. I showed up early, hoping to beat the awkwardness, and sat down by the window to keep an eye out. I sat there for about an hour. I kept checking my phone, thinking maybe she was running late or something. I figured she'd text if she couldn't make it, but nothing. Just silence. At this point, I'm starting to get a little annoyed, but also kind of confused. I hadn't seen her walk by or even get out of an Uber or anything, so I texted her again, asking if she was on her way. Still nothing. I sat there for another 20 minutes, starting to wonder if this was all some kind of sick prank. But I'm not the type to go full conspiracy mode. Maybe she just wasn't into me and didn't know how to say it. People do weird things, right? So I decided to give it a bit longer. Maybe she'd show up eventually. That's when I got the first text from her in hours. It wasn't much. Just a simple, hey, sorry, I'm stuck in traffic. Gonna be like 30 more minutes. I stared at it for a second, and then something clicked. I thought back to the messages, the way she'd always been so available, always right there when I needed her. But now it was like something shifted. Maybe it was me just overthinking it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I waited. Another 30 minutes. Still no Amy. At this point, I'm getting pissed. I texted her again, asking if she was really coming or if I should just leave. I gave it another 10 minutes before I decided to get up and go. As I grabbed my stuff, I had a weird gut feeling. I don't know why, but something felt off. Like I was being watched, but not in a creepy way. More like, I'm not really supposed to be here kind of way. That's when my phone buzzed again. Another message from her. Hey, I'm so sorry. I ended up getting caught in something. Can we try again next weekend? I promise I'll be there. I was done by this point. Something wasn't adding up, and I wasn't in the mood to deal with any of it. So I told her in a somewhat passive-aggressive way that I wasn't interested anymore. That was the last thing I sent. And that should have been the end of it, right? But then things got weird. The next day, I started getting messages from a random number. No name, just some weird long message that sounded like a bot. I ignored it at first, thinking it was some spam crap, but then they kept coming in. The messages weren't about anything in particular, just weird, cryptic phrases like, you're not supposed to be here, and you think you know who I am, but you don't. I tried to block the number, but they'd come from a different one every time. Then, a few days later, I got a text from Amy's account. At first, I thought maybe I had mistakenly unblocked her or something, but then I looked closer at the number. It wasn't the same one as before. The message this time was simple, like she was just checking in to see if I was okay. That was the moment when I realized something was really off. I went back to her profile to see if she had posted anything new, just to, I don't know, make sense of what was happening. But her account was gone. Totally wiped. And when I Googled her name, no social media, no nothing. The weird part was I still couldn't shake that feeling I'd been getting, the feeling of being watched. I even started hearing knocks on my door in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was just my neighbors, but then it started happening more frequently, and when I opened the door to check, nothing, every time. I figured maybe I was just losing it, or maybe I was being paranoid. But then one night, I was sitting in my room scrolling through some random YouTube videos to distract myself, and that's when I saw it. A video of Amy. Not the Amy from Tinder, but a woman that looked just like her. Same smile, same features, same vibe. But the video was from a few years ago. The description under it said something like, "A prank gone wrong." So I watched it. I couldn't help myself. The woman in the video was talking about how she'd been part of some long-running joke, but the way she talked, it was weird, like she was holding back something. And then, towards the end, she starts looking directly at the camera and says, "I know you're watching, and now I know you found me. It's not over." That's when I realized I wasn't talking to Amy. I wasn't talking to anyone who was real. It was just some dude named Andy. I've been on a lot of weird Tinder dates, but this one sticks with me. It wasn't anything insane at first. No red flags, no major gut feelings telling me to run. But by the end of the night, I was wondering what the hell I'd gotten myself into. So here's how it went down. Marcus and I had been chatting for a while. His profile said he loved Friends, and that was an immediate win in my book. Honestly, I don't know how many hours of my life I've wasted watching that show. Anyway, we had a few back and forths about it, talking about our favorite episodes, comparing our favorite characters. It was one of those typical Tinder conversations that didn't seem like a waste of time. So we decided to meet up. We agreed to go for dinner. Nothing fancy, just a local pizza place. I got there first and waited by the door. I could already tell he was one of those people who's kind of nervous but tries to cover it up with awkward jokes and random facts. I wasn't exactly blown away by how he looked, but he was cute enough. Maybe a little too eager, but whatever, I didn't mind. We grabbed a table and he immediately started talking about Friends again. He'd quote half the show, like word for word. It was honestly kind of impressive. The dinner was fine, nothing special. We talked about a bunch of random things, our jobs, random childhood memories, what we wanted to do over the weekend. He seemed normal enough. By the end of the night, I was starting to think maybe this could go somewhere, or at least I wouldn't have to block him right away. It was getting pretty late when we finished, and I was checking my phone trying to figure out how I was gonna get home. The buses had stopped running and I wasn't in the mood to walk, especially with the rain starting to pick up outside. So I mentioned it casually, like, "I guess I'll just grab a cab or something." Marcus immediately offered to give me a ride, which I thought was nice enough, so I accepted. On the way back to my place, we kept chatting about random stuff. He asked if I wanted to hang out for a bit once we got there, since we both loved Friends, and he knew I probably had some episodes lined up. I was like, sure, why not? I mean, it wasn't like I was doing anything else. We got to my place and I invited him in. I wasn't planning on anything happening, but I figured a little company wouldn't hurt, right? Plus, he seemed chill enough. I let him crash on my couch, but not in a weird, let's get cozy way, just, watching TV. It was one of those I barely know you but sure, let's chill situations. We started binge watching Friends. It's honestly such a comfort show, so I wasn't worried about it. We were both just sitting on the couch, talking about the episodes as they went by. At some point, I looked at the clock and realized it was getting really late, like 2 a.m. late, and I was just exhausted. I didn't want him to leave, but at the same time, I didn't want him hanging around if he was gonna be weird about it. So I figured, what the hell, I'll let him stay the night. But on the floor. I told him he could crash on the floor in my living room. He seemed fine with it, said something like, "I'm cool with it," which I guess was supposed to reassure me. At least he wasn't trying to push it, like some people do when they think being polite will get them somewhere. I turned off the lights and tried to fall asleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. You know how you sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and just feel off for no reason? I couldn't really place it, but I kept tossing and turning, trying to ignore it. The clock on my nightstand read 3 a.m. when I finally forced myself to roll over and check the time. I expected to see the usual shadows of the room. Instead, I froze. Marcus was standing there, not standing up like normal. He was sitting right beside my bed. His back was to me, but his head was tilted just enough so I could see his profile. He wasn't moving. He wasn't doing anything. He was just sitting there, completely still, staring at the ground like some kind of mannequin. I don't know what happened next. I just remember I freaked the hell out. I screamed like a legit scream, and when I did, Marcus jolted. He turned around with this completely blank look on his face, like he had no idea what had just happened. He said something like, "Oh, sorry, I was sleepwalking," in this weird, soft tone. I wasn't buying it. Like, come on, who sleeps in someone's room at 3 a.m. and just sits there in total silence? Sleepwalking my ass, I just stared at him, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what was going on. I asked him again if he was serious, and he nodded like it was normal. He said he had done it before, sleepwalked, and sometimes ended up in random places without realizing it. I just didn't buy it. It felt too weird. I told him to go back to the couch, and I locked the door behind me before I even thought about getting back into bed. I stayed up for a while, my mind racing, not knowing what to think. I'm not one of those paranoid types, but that whole thing was just too creepy. The next morning, I woke up around 8 a.m., still on edge, and I found Marcus already up, making coffee in the kitchen like it was no big deal. I don't know what I expected. Maybe him to act embarrassed or at least acknowledge how messed up the whole thing was. But no, he was acting totally normal, almost like nothing had happened. I couldn't handle it. I told him he needed to leave like immediately. He didn't push back, didn't argue. He just grabbed his stuff and left without a word. After that, I blocked him. I didn't care if it was rude or harsh. I just couldn't get over how weird that whole situation felt. Maybe it was the sleepwalking, or maybe it was a feeling that he'd been watching me while I was asleep. Either way, I didn't want to find out what else he was capable of. Marcus was the kind of guy you should trust at first, but after that night, I realized sometimes trust can't be built in a few hours. It can be destroyed in a few minutes. I just thank God I never saw him again. I thought it was just going on a normal Tinder date, maybe grab dinner, see if we clicked, but I had no idea what was in store for me. Honestly, when I look back, I still can't figure out what happened and why it escalated the way it did. So buckle up because this story is a weird one. I matched with Todd about a week ago. His profile didn't stand out too much, but he seemed like a chill guy. His pictures were normal, no weird flexing selfies or cryptic quotes. He was smiling, had a dog in a few of them, and looked pretty average. He even had a few mutual friends, so I figured, hey, why not give it a shot? We started texting, and things were going fine. He seemed cool, a little more forward than some guys, but not in a creepy way, more like just confident. He asked me about my hobbies, what I did for work, where I had been traveling. The usual stuff. I was into it because it didn't feel forced. We talked about random stuff, like the food we liked and TV shows we were into. Pretty standard. After a couple of days of messaging, we agreed to meet up. He suggested a local diner, which I was fine with. It was public, casual, no pressure. I showed up first, grabbed a booth by the window. The place wasn't fancy, but I liked that it was chill. I've been to this diner before, so I felt comfortable. Todd showed up maybe 10 minutes later, looking exactly like his pictures. I don't know why I was relieved by that, but I was. I guess it's always nice when someone isn't hiding behind filters or weird angles. We greeted each other, and I slid over to make room in the booth. The first few minutes were normal. We chatted about our days, some work stuff, our families. But then things got a little strange. He started asking deeper questions, like really deep ones. He wanted to know what I thought about marriage, whether I believed in love at first sight, and if I could see myself getting married in the next few years. I thought it was a little odd, but I played along. I mean, who doesn't talk about marriage at some point? Maybe he was just looking for someone serious, which is fine. I told him I wasn't in any rush, but eventually I could see it happening with the right person. We ate our food, talked about movies, and just hung out like normal people. Nothing out of the ordinary yet. But then, as we finished up our coffee and dessert, Todd leaned in across the table, and out of nowhere dropped the bomb. He said he could see us getting married, like right then and there. I laughed, thinking it was a joke. It was just too absurd to take seriously. I mean, we'd known each other for like 2 hours, and he was talking about marriage, but he didn't laugh with me. He just kept staring at me, his eyes wide, almost desperate. I'm serious, he said, almost pleading now. I know it's soon, but I just feel like we're meant to be together. You and me. We have so much in common. I can already picture it. Us getting married, building a life together. I remember just staring at him for a second, trying to process what he just said. Was he on something? Was this some kind of weird test? I tried to be polite and just brush it off, but Todd wasn't letting it go. He kept going, saying how he had a connection with me that he couldn't explain, how he knew we were perfect for each other. It was starting to feel less like a normal conversation and more like some kind of pressure cooker. He kept pushing. I started to get uncomfortable. It was all happening way too fast. I didn't know this guy. We just met. Sure, the date had gone okay, but marriage. What kind of person asks someone that after 2 hours? I tried to stay calm, saying that we should just take things slow, maybe go on another date or something. But he just wasn't hearing it. He told me he'd been looking for the one for a while now, and he had a feeling about me. It was getting way too intense, and I could feel my stomach twist. My heart was racing, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. I didn't want to be rude, but at the same time, I needed to get out of there. I had to find a way to change the subject, so I started talking about the weather or some random topic, anything to redirect his focus. But Todd wasn't having it. He kept circling back to this marriage talk. At this point, I was getting really weirded out. He even pulled out a ring. Yeah, you heard that right. A ring from his pocket. He said he'd been saving it for someone special, and he wanted me to have it. I felt my entire body freeze. I wanted to scream. I tried to stay calm and polite, saying that I wasn't ready for something like this and that it was all too fast. He apologized, but then immediately asked if he could walk me in my car. I just couldn't deal with it anymore. I said no thanks and told him I'd be fine. He seemed disappointed, but I didn't care. I needed space. I made a quick excuse and bolted. The whole walk to my car felt like a blur. I could feel his eyes on me, even from a distance. As I started my car, I checked my phone. There were 3 missed texts from Todd. The first was him apologizing, saying he didn't mean to freak me out. The second said he hoped I would think about his offer. The third just said, I hope you realize I'm the one for you. I was done. I blocked him right then and there. No more texting, no more second chances. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was really off about him. The desperation, the way he tried to control the conversation, the ring, everything. It was too much, way too much for a first date. Maybe it was just a mix of being socially awkward, or maybe he just didn't know boundaries, but whatever it was, it creeped me out. After that, I told a few friends about what happened, and they couldn't believe it either. It was just too wild to be real, but there it was, one of the most unsettling experiences I've ever had with someone from Tinder. Todd, if you're reading this, please never do that to anyone else. Safe to say I deleted Tinder shortly after that, at least for a while. That's not the kind of dating I was looking for. I should have known better. Honestly, I should have. But this is one of those situations where everything seemed fine at first and snowballed into a mess so fast I couldn't catch up. It all started on Tinder. I know. Anyone who's ever used the app knows that stuff can get weird fast. But this wasn't your typical, hey, want to meet up for coffee kind of weird. No, this was the kind of weird that completely blindsides you and makes you question your judgment for weeks after. So, her name was Linda. She popped up in my matches one day. She was cute, like really cute. She had that kind of natural look to her. Nothing over the top, no filter-heavy selfies, just casual pictures of her hiking, at the beach, or hanging out with friends. Seemed like a genuine person. We started talking and hit it off pretty quickly. We talked about our hobbies, our favorite music, all that usual stuff. It was nice. Nothing too intense, but she was easy to talk to. A couple of days into chatting, we started talking more about our lives. She mentioned that she lived a few states away. I'll be honest. I didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't the first time I've been talking to someone on Tinder who lived far away. But she seemed really cool, and we had a ton in common, so we kept chatting. After a few weeks, she asked if I'd be down to meet up. I was excited. She said she wanted to come visit me and that there was a catch. It wasn't a huge thing, just a small request. She said she needed some help with her plane ticket. Apparently, she didn't get paid until the next week and was short about $1,000 for the flight. She assured me that once she got her paycheck, she'd send the money back. She even fast-timed me to prove she was real. Her story seemed legit. She showed me the flight details and everything, proof that she was actually planning to come. I wasn't sure about it at first. $1,000 is a lot of money, especially for someone I hadn't even met yet. But Linda seemed so convincing. She was really sweet on the phone, apologizing and saying how much she wanted to see me. She even said, if you can just help me out, I'll pay you back as soon as I can. I promise. And she had that look in her eyes that made me want to believe her. I don't know why, but I did. I know it sounds insane now, but I honestly thought I was doing something nice. I was excited about meeting her, and I figured, what's a little money for the chance to meet someone awesome? She had a whole plan laid out, and I felt like I could trust her. I agreed to send her the money. She sent me her PayPal info, and I transferred the full amount. She was ecstatic. She told me how much this meant to her, and she couldn't wait to come see me. I felt good, like I was helping her, and soon we'd be able to hang out and have the time of our lives. For the next couple of days, she was texting me nonstop. She'd tell me how much she missed me already and how excited she was to meet. But then, as time went on, the messages started to slow down. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe she was busy getting ready for the trip or just doing her thing. But as the days passed, it started to feel off. She was texting me less and less. Her replies were short and vague, like she was distracted or not really paying attention. I started getting worried. Maybe I was being paranoid, but it didn't feel right. I tried calling her, but she didn't answer. I shot her a text asking if everything was okay, and she responded with some excuse about how she'd been busy with work. The more I tried to talk to her, the more distant she seemed. And then one night, I got home after work, opened my phone, and saw the worst thing I could imagine. Linda had blocked me. No warning, no explanation, nothing. Just poof, gone. I sat there for a second, staring at my screen in disbelief. I tried calling her, tried texting her, but there was nothing. It hit me all at once. I'd just been scammed. I felt like an idiot. The money was gone. I had nothing to show for it, not even a chance to meet her in person. And what hurt the most was how easily she had manipulated me. She had played it so well, acting sweet, apologetic, and convincing, making me feel like I was helping her out of a tough situation. I couldn't believe how stupid I'd been. I spent the next few hours trying to get in touch with her, but it was no use. She was gone. I checked all my social media to see if I could find any trace of her. I even Googled her name to see if anything came up, but it was like she didn't exist. There was no Linda, no trace of her anywhere except for our conversations on Tinder. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. The worst part, I wasn't the only one. After a few days, I started seeing posts from other guys on Reddit and various forums talking about the same thing happening to them. They all had the same story. Linda, the sweet girl from Tinder who needed help with her plane ticket, who promised she'd pay them back and then disappeared once the money was sent. I don't know how many people she's done this to, but it was enough to make me sick to my stomach. It wasn't just about the money, it was the betrayal. The way she had made me feel like we had a connection, like I was actually helping her out, and then just tossed me aside when she got what she wanted. I'll admit I was really upset for a while. I felt embarrassed and humiliated, like I'd been taken for a fool. But eventually, I realized it wasn't my fault. She had used my kindness against me, and I wasn't the only one. So yeah, that's the story of how I got scammed by someone I thought I could trust. I still don't know how she did it so convincingly, but I'll tell you this, I'll never, ever make that mistake again. So this story is something that's been stuck in my head for weeks now. I still don't really know what to make of it, but looking back, I'm honestly kind of freaked out about the whole thing. Here's what happened. I matched with Hannah on Tinder. She was cute, really easy to talk to, and we clicked pretty quickly. Nothing too intense at first, just your usual conversations about music, TV shows, and whatnot. We talked for a few days, and everything seemed pretty chill. Honestly, she was one of those people who made you feel comfortable, like no weird red flags or anything, just casual banter. After a bit of texting, we agreed to meet up for coffee. I was kind of excited about it. Don't get me wrong, I was still a little cautious, but she seemed normal, and I was ready to actually meet someone in person after a while of just swiping left and right. So the day comes. I get to the cafe a little early, grab a table by the window. I wasn't exactly nervous, but I always like to give myself a minute to settle in before meeting someone new. I'm not gonna lie, I checked my phone a few times to make sure I wasn't about to be catfish or anything. But no, she was texting me, letting me know she was almost there. Then the door opened, and there she was. She looked just like her pictures, and I was relieved about that. We said hi and hugged. Nothing weird, just the usual first meeting stuff. She sat down across from me, we ordered our drinks, and it was fine. Like, really chill. We started talking about stuff. Life, school, work, whatever. At first, I didn't really feel any kind of weird vibe. It was like we were just having a casual conversation, like we were old friends or something. But then, As I'm talking to her, my eyes wander around the cafe a bit, and that's when I see it. Right there on her desk, framed and sitting on top of some books, was a picture of me. A photo exactly like one I posted on my Instagram just last week. I froze. I didn't know what to think. The picture was from a hiking trip I did with some friends, and it was nothing special, just me standing on a rock, looking out at the view. It was a nice picture, but nothing that special. I could recognize it immediately. I hadn't even thought about it since posting it, but there it was, framed on her desk, and it was so random. I don't know why, but it sent a weird chill down my spine. It wasn't like she had just a few photos of people she knew. This was a single picture of me, blown up and framed like it was a piece of art or something. At first, I thought maybe she'd just taken a screenshot from my Instagram and printed it out for fun, but that felt way off. I tried to keep my cool. I didn't want to seem paranoid or rude, but I had to ask, so I pointed at the picture and asked her about it. She smiled almost too casually and said, "Oh, I like to keep track of my favorites." I didn't know what to say to that. It didn't make any sense. What did she mean by favorites? I didn't even know her well enough to be in the favorites category. Plus, it was my picture. Not a famous one, not some well-known landscape photo or anything like that. Just my regular photo from a hiking trip. I should have just walked out at that point, but I didn't. I stayed. I kept talking to her, but the whole time I couldn't stop looking at the picture. It felt like it was staring back at me. The conversation kept going, but it was like everything felt distant. I was still hearing her, but my brain was stuck on that picture. It didn't help that every few minutes, I could see her glancing at the framed photo like she was checking to see if I noticed it again. It felt like she was waiting for me to say something else about it. At some point, I asked her, more out of confusion than anything else, how she even got the picture. I mean, Instagram doesn't exactly make it easy to steal photos, so how did she get that one? She smiled kind of sheepishly and said, "I'm good at finding things online." It felt wrong, like she was playing it off too easily. At that point, I should have left. I should have gotten up, ate for my coffee, and walked out the door without a second thought. But I didn't. I stayed. I don't know why. Maybe I was just too weirded out to act on it right away, or maybe part of me thought I was overthinking things. But as the conversation continued, it just got stranger. She kept talking, but the words blurred together. I was only half listening, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was really off about this whole situation. The whole keeping track of favorites thing. It didn't sit right with me. It wasn't normal, at least not to me. And then after a while, she suggested we go for a walk in the park nearby. I agreed, but honestly, I was feeling like I just needed to get away. But I didn't want to be rude, so I followed her. We walked, but the whole time I kept glancing at her phone, which she was holding in her hand. She wasn't looking at it much, but I noticed that every now and then she'd glance at me with this weird look in her eyes. It wasn't the getting to know you look anymore. It was, I don't know, more intense. It was like she was studying me, trying to figure me out. I don't know how long we walked for, but eventually I just couldn't take it anymore. I felt like I was in a bad movie and I needed to leave. I made an excuse about needing to go home, and she didn't argue. When I got home, I took a deep breath, tried to shake off the weird feeling in my gut, and checked my phone. I had a message from her. It was short, a simple, "Hey, it was nice meeting you." I responded, but as I hit send, I noticed something odd. She'd unfriended me on Instagram, like completely removed me. And then she blocked me on Tinder. At that point, everything clicked. She wasn't just casually interested. She'd been keeping tabs on me. She had been tracking me somehow. I never heard from her again, and honestly, I've been trying to move on from it. But every time I see a photo from that trip on my Instagram feed, I get a little uneasy. It's like she's out there somewhere still watching, still keeping track of her favorites. And honestly, I don't know if I'll ever understand why she did that, but I don't want to know either. Some things are better left unanswered. Okay, so this is something that happened to me about 6 months ago, and honestly, I still can't shake it. It's the kind of thing where, even though I want to forget it, my brain keeps circling back to it, and now I just need to get it out. So I matched with Tina on Tinder. At first, it was like any other match. She seemed normal, cute pictures, a little witty, and we got along pretty well in the beginning. I mean, her profile was nothing too out of the ordinary, just the usual stuff. Hobbies, music tastes, and a couple of travel photos. Nothing that screamed red flags. We started chatting every day, It wasn't anything super intense at first, but it was nice. She'd ask about my day, and I'd share what was going on in my life. Sometimes we'd swap memes or talk about what we were watching on Netflix. Basic stuff, right? But after a week of texting, she started asking more personal questions. Not creepy at first, but more detailed. Like, what's your biggest fear? Or what was the hardest thing you've ever had to do? And me being me, I answered them. I figured whatever, she's just trying to get to know me. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I should have. A couple of days later, I was on a walk with my friend Sarah when I got a message from Tina. It was weirdly timed because it was like Tina knew exactly when I was free to chat. I know that sounds dumb, but trust me, I remember it so clearly. I'd been texting her just before I left my house, and when I got outside, she was asking me what I was doing. I didn't think it was that strange at first, but it felt off, like she was watching my every move. So I replied, just heading out for a walk with Sarah, and I just went out my day. Later that night, things started getting a lot weirder. I got a message from Tina that said, nice walk. How was the weather? I froze. How did she know I went for a walk? I didn't even tell her that. I hadn't posted anything on social media about it. Sarah was with me and she didn't mention anything to anyone. My immediate thought was that maybe Tina was stalking my social media profile somehow, but I checked. Nothing. I hadn't posted any pictures or updates. But it didn't stop there. The next day, I got another message from her. It was about something I'd told Sarah during our walk. We were talking about an embarrassing moment from high school, and somehow Tina knew all the details. Stuff I had never shared on any platform, not even with my closest friends. Stuff I had told maybe 2 or 3 people in total. But here was Tina, casually mentioning it in a message like she'd been there, like she was listening in. My stomach dropped. I asked her, how do you know about that? Her reply was something like, you told me about it last week, remember? And that's when I started getting seriously weirded out, because I hadn't told her about it. I hadn't even mentioned it at all. The weirdest thing was that, even though she was giving me this very casual response, it felt like she knew more than I did. Like she was one step ahead of me every time. But it didn't end there. It got a whole lot worse. A couple of days later, I started getting texts from random numbers. At first, it was just cryptic stuff. A few strange emojis followed by, you better not forget about me, and I know where you live. I tried to brush it off as a joke, but then the messages got more specific. She started mentioning things that I hadn't told her, not in our texts anyway. Stuff like the exact hours I work at my part-time job, the names of people I worked with, where I went grocery shopping. It was getting way too personal. She even sent me a picture of my apartment building from across the street, taken during the day when I was out at work. It was like she was stalking me, and I couldn't figure out how. My friends started getting weird DMs too, saying things like, I hope you're taking care of your friend, insert my name here. And that's when I realized Tina wasn't just texting me. She was going through my entire life, finding out everything she could about me and my circle. I started getting paranoid. I checked all my social media profiles and everything was locked down. My Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, nothing was public, and yet somehow she seemed to know everything. I even checked my phone to see if maybe I'd accidentally shared information through an app or something. Nothing. Then one night, I got the text that made everything click. Tina sent me a screenshot of a text conversation I had with my mom. I hadn't even realized it, but Tina had somehow gained access to my phone and was reading my private conversations. The screenshot she sent was from a week ago, and the message was something personal, something only I would have known about. I was floored. I didn't know how she'd gotten into my messages. It was like she was in my life, pulling the strings from behind the scenes, manipulating everything. That's when I realized I wasn't just dealing with someone who was curious or weirdly obsessed. I was dealing with someone who was actively watching me, who was making moves in my life without me even realizing it. And it terrified me. I tried to block her number, but the texts kept coming. They kept getting more intense, more threatening. She would threaten to post embarrassing photos of me, spread rumors, or even show up at my job and make a scene. It felt like I was being suffocated by her. I couldn't escape. Finally, after I told my family and some friends about what was going on, I realized I had to report it. It took a few weeks for the authorities to trace back her information, but what they found was honestly even creepier. Tina didn't just know me. She'd been following me for months before I even matched with her on Tinder. She'd been hacking into people's phones, gaining access to private information, and blackmailing people to get what she wanted. She was using Tinder as a way to get closer to new victims like me. They never found her, though. I don't know if she went underground or if she's still out there, but I haven't heard from her since. Now, whenever I meet someone online, I'm always suspicious. Even the most innocent conversations seem like potential threats. But that was my experience with Tina, and I'll never forget how close she came to destroying everything I had worked hard to keep private. It's weird though. Part of me still wonders how she even started to find me in the first place. Was it just sheer luck? Or was she targeting me from the beginning? Either way, I'll never trust another Tinder match again. Alright, this is the craziest thing that's ever happened to me, and it still makes me cringe every time I think about it. It started like a normal Tinder date, but quickly turned into something I never saw coming. It's still hard to wrap my head around, but here goes. So, I matched with Gary a couple of weeks ago. He seemed like a total catch. Charming, a little older, maybe in his late 30s, good looking, and seemed to have his life together. He even had this whole sophisticated vibe going on. He mentioned that he worked in finance and that he loved trying out new restaurants in London, especially the high-end ones. Honestly, I didn't think much of it. I was just looking for someone fun to hang out with. We chatted a lot for a few days. He was funny, well-spoken, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. Eventually, he suggested we meet up, and he mentioned something about taking me to a nice place in London. I figured it'd be fun to get dressed up, so I agreed. When the day came, I got myself all dolled up, a little more than usual, because I had a feeling it might be fancy. I wasn't wrong. Here he told me he'd made reservations at the Ritz, and I nearly laughed in his face, like who just casually goes to the Ritz on a Tinder date. But then again, he had that finance guy persona, and everything he told me seemed to check out. So I was like, why not? I showed up at the Ritz, and I felt instantly out of place, to be honest. The place was insanely fancy, like something out of a movie. The doorman was in a full suit, and people were walking around in tuxedos. Gary was already there, standing by the entrance, looking as sharp as ever. I walked in, trying not to act like I was completely out of my depth, and he smiled when he saw me. Dinner was great, or at least I thought so. The atmosphere was perfect. The food was amazing. I mean, we're talking 40 pounds plates of fish and chips, and Gary was on his best behavior. He was charming, asking questions, keeping the conversation light. It honestly felt like one of those perfect nights where everything just clicks. We laughed about stupid things, talked about life, and I honestly thought this could turn into something. I was even starting to think, maybe this guy's the real deal. Then came the moment I'd been dreading, the bill. The waiter brought it over, and as soon as he placed it on the table, Gary's face shifted. He reached into his pocket for his wallet, pulled out his card, and handed it to the waiter. I didn't think much of it at first. Then the waiter came back. Gary's card had declined. At this point, I assumed it was just a minor hiccup. Maybe the card was maxed out. Maybe there was a problem with his bank. No big deal, right? But Gary looked, well, kind of panicked. He tried to put on this calm face, but I could see the beads of sweat forming on his forehead. I don't know if he was nervous or embarrassed, but something was off. The waiter left and came back a couple of times. Gary kept giving him different cards to try, but each one was declined. By the third time, I started to feel really uncomfortable. I'd been sitting there quietly, wondering if I should step in, but I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to be rude, but when the waiter walked away for the final time, Gary turned to me, looking visibly shaken. And then it hit me. He asked if I could pay for the bill. I'm not even kidding. After everything, after the expensive dinner, the fancy atmosphere, the whole thing, he asked me if I could cover the 300 pounds bill. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know if I was being punked or if this was just some twisted joke. I tried to laugh it off at first, but he wasn't laughing. He seemed serious. I was in total disbelief. I mean, yeah, sure, sometimes stuff happens, but this was just too much. I told him that I didn't have that kind of money just lying around, who does, and that I was there to enjoy a date, not pick up the tab for someone I just met. I tried to stay calm, but inside I was freaking out. How had this guy ended up in this situation? What kind of person asks someone they just met to pay for a dinner at the Ritz? But it didn't end there. Gary wasn't backing down. He just stared at me with this look of expectation, like it was no big deal. It was honestly starting to feel like I was in some kind of nightmare. I started to feel trapped. The waiter was standing nearby, waiting for an answer, and there was no way I was walking out of there without paying something. Then Gary said something that made me really uncomfortable. He asked if I could drop him off at his mom's house after dinner. He explained that it wasn't too far out of my way and that he could explain things to his mom. At this point, I was just stunned. First, he asked me to pay for his meal, and now he wants a ride to his mom's house. This was insane. I gave him a quick excuse, saying that I had to get home early and couldn't give him a ride. But by this point, I had enough. I started looking for my purse, trying to figure out how I was going to get out of this mess. Gary just sat there looking completely unbothered, like it was normal, like this was some everyday thing for him. Then, without another word, I paid the bill. I felt sick to my stomach, but I didn't have much of a choice. I wasn't going to cause a scene in a place like that. But the moment I swiped my card, Gary stood up, barely even said thank you, and walked out. That was the last time I saw him. As soon as I left the restaurant and got into my car, I checked my phone and realized he had blocked me. Just like that. The guy I just spent hours with, laughing, chatting, enjoying a perfect evening, had completely cut me off. No explanation, no apology, just gone. And I haven't heard from him since. Honestly, I'm still not sure what his deal was. Was he broke and just trying to scam me? Did he think I wouldn't notice the whole thing was weird from the start? I don't know, but it felt like a complete setup. I feel like I got caught up in some weird con, but I was too naive to see it coming. I'm just glad I made it out of there without getting into even more trouble. But man, I'll never forget that night. I think it'll be a long time before I trust someone I meet online again. Okay, I had some weird dates, but this one with Evan, hands down the most unsettling. I'm still not sure if it was just a weird coincidence or if this dude was a little off, but either way, I felt like I was being watched the whole time. So I matched with this guy Evan on Tinder a few weeks ago. He seemed pretty normal at first. His profile was full of pics that looked like they were taken in cool places. One at a concert, another at the beach, and a few with friends. Nothing that screamed red flag. So I figured I'd give him a shot. We started texting nonstop, and he was super chill. We talked about everything, movies, food, random things that came up. He was actually pretty funny, and I started looking forward to our chats. He didn't seem like the typical, hey, what's up, kind of guy, so I was intrigued. After a couple of days, Eden suggested we meet up for coffee at a cafe near my place. Nothing fancy, just a casual hangout, which I thought was perfect. I mean, I wasn't really in the mood for anything more intense. A coffee date is usually pretty low pressure. He said he'd be there early, but I told him I'd probably arrive a bit late because of work. So the day comes and I walk into this cute little cafe. It's got this vintage vibe with old school furniture and that warm, cozy atmosphere you get from places that serve amazing lats. I was honestly pretty excited to meet him. I walk in and scan the room. I don't see Ann right away, so I grab a seat by the window, pull out my phone, and start scrolling through my messages. It wasn't super busy in there, so I figured I'd spot him in a minute. Then about 5 minutes later, I get a text from Evan that just says, "I'm right behind you." I froze for a second. I was confused. Had he been here the whole time? How did I not notice him when I walked in? I turned around, and sure enough, Evan was sitting at a table across the room just staring at me. He waved kind of awkwardly. I gave a halfway back, trying to play it cool. But honestly, something felt off. I figured he'd probably been sitting there before I came in, and maybe I just didn't see him. But the way he phrased the text, like he'd been watching me the whole time, just felt weird. It was like he was trying to be casual, but I could tell he wasn't really acting normal. It was almost like he was waiting for me to notice him, and I'm not sure why, but that made me feel uneasy. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so I decided to just go over and sit with him. I grabbed my stuff and walked over to his table. He stood up to greet me, and as soon as I sat down, I realized just how long he must have been there. There was a cup of coffee in front of him, but it wasn't fresh. It was one of those cups that had clearly been sitting out for a while. We started talking, but the whole vibe was off. I tried to keep things light, ask him about his day. What had he been up to? But he just seemed off. He kept looking at me, but not in the usual way. It wasn't like he was trying to get to know me. It felt more like he was sizing me up, like he was trying to figure me out. I'm all for deep conversations, but this wasn't that. He just kept glancing around the cafe and then back at me, like he was keeping tabs on everything. The more I sat there, the more uncomfortable I became. It felt like I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me, even when I wasn't looking at him. I could hear him fidgeting with his phone under the table, but every time I looked at him, he quickly put it down and looked at me like nothing happened. There was something off about the way he was sitting too. Like, he was too stiff, almost like he was waiting for something. It wasn't the normal body language you'd expect on a first date. It was like he was trying to act casual but couldn't quite pull it off. Every time I took a sip of my drink, I caught him staring at me. It was starting to make me feel like I had something stuck on my face or like I was doing something weird that I didn't know about. I didn't want to be rude, so I tried to make small talk, asking him about his favorite places to go in London and what he liked doing for fun. But he barely seemed interested in answering. Instead, he kept turning the conversation back to me, asking about my childhood, where I grew up, and even my family's financial situation. I didn't answer half of it, but it just felt like he was digging too deep for someone I just met. At one point, I decided to just get up and go to the bathroom, hoping to reset the vibe a little. When I came back, Evan was staring at his phone with a weird grin on his face. He didn't acknowledge me right away, which felt odd. Normally, when someone's on their phone and you come back, they'll at least glance up, but Evan didn't. It was like he was lost in whatever he was looking at. When he finally looked up, he gave me a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The whole thing was starting to feel less like a date and more like some weird, uncomfortable interaction I couldn't get out of. And then, this is the weirdest part. He started talking about how he'd done some research on me. He casually mentioned some places I'd been, places I visited recently, even stuff I posted online, stuff I hadn't shared with him. Not once did he bring up anything I'd said in our texts, but somehow he knew things about my life. Not huge things, but little details like where I went for my last vacation, what kind of pets I had, things that weren't even in my social media profiles. It made my stomach drop. I didn't know what to say, so I just laughed it off. But inside, I was freaking out. This was crossing the line. How had he gotten that information? And he'd been stalking my social media. How did he know I'd been to that cafe a month ago with some friends? As I tried to push the conversation in another direction, Evan looked at his phone again and smirked. It felt like everything about him was shifting from friendly to unsettling. The more he spoke, the less I wanted to be there. Finally, I just said I had to leave. I didn't want to stay a second longer, but as I stood up to leave, Evan did something that almost made my heart stop. He stared at me for a moment, then said, "I'll see you soon," with this really weird, cryptic tone. I left the cafe as quickly as I could, my heart racing. The whole date had just been wrong. I never heard from him again, but I also never saw him on Tinder. It was like he disappeared from the app entirely. I blocked him just to be safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about that day. I kept thinking about how long he must have been watching me from across the cafe. I don't know what his deal was, but I hope I never run into him again. All right, so I've been debating whether I should share this or not, but honestly, I can't get this guy Luke out of my head. I'm hoping that if I talk about it, maybe I'll start to make sense of it, or at least get it off my chest. Either way, this whole thing freaked me out. I matched with Luke on Tinder. We hit it off almost immediately, which was cool because I wasn't expecting much. Usually you match with someone, chat for a bit, and the conversation fizzles out, right? But with Luke, it felt different. We had this effortless chemistry. He was funny, and we were on the same wavelength about so many things. Music, movies, even random stuff like food preferences. We talked about everything and anything, and it was nice. We started texting each other nonstop for a couple of days, and it didn't feel forced. I was genuinely excited to meet him in person. After a few days of texting, Luke suggested we hang out at his place. He seemed chill about it, saying it'd be just a casual night, watching some movies, maybe grabbing a snack. I liked that he wasn't pressuring me for anything. It sounded like a no-stress way to finally meet him in person. I agreed, and he sent me his address. I remember walking to his place feeling pretty normal about the whole thing. We talked enough that I didn't get any weird vibes from him. In fact, I was kind of excited to finally meet face to face. When I got to his apartment, he greeted me at the door with a smile and let me in. His place was nice, clean, organized, kind of minimalist, but nothing out of the ordinary. He showed me to the living room where we sat down and started talking. At first, everything seemed totally normal. We were chatting about stuff we'd talked about before. TV shows, mooks, our favorite kinds of food. It was light, fun, and I felt pretty comfortable. But then I noticed something. His phone was lying on the counter, and the screen was facing up. I could see my own Tinder profile staring back at me. My first thought was, okay, that's a little weird, but I laughed it off. Maybe he was just looking at it for some reason. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so I just ignored it and kept talking. As the night went on, things started to get a little odd. Luke was asking me questions that felt way too personal. At first, I didn't think much of it. He asked about my favorite things to do, my family, my job, all the usual stuff. But then the questions started to get more specific, like he wanted to know the exact time I wake up every day, what my routine is when I normally go to bed, how I spend my weekends. I'm not going to lie, it felt kind of off. It wasn't just casual conversation anymore. He was asking about my daily life like he was trying to map out my whole existence. I tried to brush it off, but as the night went on, I started feeling more and more uncomfortable. There was this weird tension in the air, like something wasn't quite right, and I couldn't put my finger on it. I started looking for an excuse to leave. I didn't want to seem rude, but the questions were getting too personal, and I wasn't feeling safe anymore. Finally, I just told him I had to go, and he seemed totally fine with it. He even walked me to the door, said it was nice to meet me, and that we should hang out again sometime. I didn't feel great about the whole thing, but I told myself it was just my nerves getting the best of me. As soon as I stepped outside, though, I got a text from him. "I'll walk you home." At first, I thought maybe he was just being polite, but something didn't sit right. I had barely walked a few steps when I looked up. There, across the street, standing on the sidewalk, was Luke. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt this sudden rush of panic. Why was he just standing there? It was like he was waiting for me to notice him. I didn't want to make a scene, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I turned my head to keep walking, but then I got another text from him. "You don't have to run. I'm just making sure you're safe." I wasn't about to stop and have a conversation about safety. My legs were already moving faster and my head was spinning. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. As I walked down the street, I kept checking behind me, but I didn't see him anywhere. I thought I'd gotten away. Then, as I was passing a store window, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection. It was Luke. He was standing right behind me, just far enough back that I couldn't hear his footsteps. I spun around, but there was no sign of him. The street was empty. For a second, I thought I'd imagined it, but that gut feeling told me I wasn't. I started walking faster, trying not to break into a full-on sprint, but I couldn't stop the panic building up in my chest. I checked my phone again. Another message. "I'm not far behind." I was starting to get really scared. It was one of those situations where you know you're in danger, but you can't explain why. I didn't want to look behind me anymore, but I could feel my breath quickening as I picked up the pace. As I turned a corner, I finally saw something that made me feel a little safer. A group of people. I walked up to them, trying not to seem too panicked, and just blended in with the crowd. My heart was still racing, but I was hoping it would pass soon. I waited with the group until I felt like it was safe enough to walk the last couple of blocks to my apartment. When I got inside, I locked the door behind me and finally let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I checked my phone again. No more texts from Luke. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying what happened. Why had he been watching me from across the street? How had he known where I was going to be walking? Why didn't I notice him sooner? I ended up blocking his number and deleting Tinder. I didn't hear from him again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Honestly, I just wanted to forget about the whole thing, but every time I walked home at night, I kept checking over my shoulder. That was the last time I ever met up with someone from Tinder. So, I don't know if I'm just cursed when it comes to dating apps, or if there's some kind of weird magnetism I have to attract the truly strange ones. But what happened to me with Isaac, I still can't shake it off. I've had my share of awkward dates, costing situations, and guys who are just way too into themselves. But this was next level. So here it goes. I matched with Isaac on Tinder. At first, things seemed chill. His profile had a bunch of artsy pictures and a cute bio. He was one of those guys who liked quirky things like vintage cameras and weirdly obscure hobbies. He seemed interesting enough to me in person, so we started texting. The conversation flowed pretty easily, and I didn't get any weird vibes. He suggested we meet at his house, saying he was making dinner and that we could hang out. He seemed normal enough, so I agreed. I wasn't really expecting anything strange. When I got to his place, it looked pretty average from the outside, nothing out of the ordinary. A little older than most places in the neighborhood, but nothing that screamed stay away. As soon as he opened the door, I noticed something that immediately felt off. The place was full of mirrors. Everywhere I looked, there was a mirror. I'm talking about mirrors in the living room, mirrors in the hallway, mirrors in the kitchen. The bathroom had an entire wall of mirrors. It wasn't like there were just a few strategically placed ones. It was like his whole house was some sort of fun house. It was unsettling. I'm not super paranoid, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I tried not to let it show. Isaac greeted me with a smile, all casual, like this was completely normal. I didn't say anything at first. I mean, it's his house, right? People have their quirks, so I made small talk, pretending to ignore the mirrors. But the more I walked around, the more I felt like I was being watched from every angle. The mirrors reflected me in a way that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't just me seeing myself in them. It was almost like they were looking at me, following me as I moved. I know that sounds a little crazy, but I swear it felt like something out of a psychological thriller. After a while, Isaac asked if I wanted a drink, so he led me to the kitchen, which of course had more mirrors. He was talking about his job or whatever, and I was just nodding along, trying not to pay too much attention to the fact that the mirrors were almost all at eye level. It was like he had one in every possible spot that would let him get a glimpse of me. The kitchen mirror was positioned in such a way that no matter where I stood, I could see my reflection in it. At this point, I started to feel a little uneasy. I know it sounds dumb, but I kept getting the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. Like, I could see myself in the mirrors, but the way they reflected things made me feel like there was someone else there too. I kept catching glimpses of figures in the corners of the mirrors, but when I looked around, there was nobody there. Maybe I was just overthinking it. But the longer I stayed, the more intense the feeling got. At one point, I asked Isaac why he had so many mirrors in his house. I tried to keep it casual, like I wasn't freaked out, but I definitely wanted to know what the deal was. He just smiled and said, "It's a hobby of mine, to see every side of you." The way he said it made my skin crawl. He didn't laugh or act like it was a joke. He just said it like it was the most normal thing in the world. I tried to laugh it off, but the atmosphere in the room shifted, like the air had gotten heavier. The more I looked around, the more the mirrors started to feel wrong. They were everywhere, in every room, and it felt like the house itself was swallowing me up. I thought about leaving, but I didn't want to seem rude, so I stuck it out. Isaac started talking more about his artistic interests and all this stuff about perspectives and seeing yourself from every angle. I wasn't really listening anymore. I couldn't focus on what he was saying. My eyes kept darting around, noticing the way the mirrors reflected things that weren't right. Sometimes when I looked into one, it seemed like the reflection was different. Like it wasn't just a mirror reflecting the room. It was like the room was changing in the reflection, but when I turned around, it was still the same. My heart started beating faster. My head felt like it was swimming. I didn't want to stay there anymore. I was starting to feel trapped, like the mirrors were closing in on me. I stood up, telling Isaac that I needed to go. I don't even remember what excuse I gave. Something about needing to get up early for work, I think. I just needed to leave. I quickly grabbed my coat and started toward the door. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was a figure in one of the mirrors, someone standing in the hallway behind me. I froze. My mind went blank. For a split second, I thought it was just my reflection. But when I looked at the hallway itself, there was nobody there. It was just me standing in the doorway. I turned around and glanced in the mirror again. The figure was still there, standing in the same spot, staring directly at me. But when I looked, there was no one behind me, just empty space. The reflection didn't make sense. I couldn't breathe. I rushed out the door, practically running to my car. I didn't even bother saying goodbye. As I drove home, I kept looking in my rearview mirror, convinced someone was following me, but I never saw anything. I couldn't stop shaking. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the mirrors, about the figure in the hallway. I didn't hear from Isaac again, and I blocked him on everything after that. I haven't been able to look at a mirror the same way since. Every time I pass one, I feel like there's someone behind me, watching, waiting. It's like Isaac's hobby is still following me around. I don't know what the hell happened that night, but I won't be going back to any guy's house with mirrors ever again. I've had my share of awkward dates. Who hasn't, right? But this one with Joe, it wasn't just awkward. It was downright uncomfortable and left me feeling weird. Like the kind of weird where you second guess everything about yourself. Let me explain. So Joe and I matched on Tinder. He seemed all right at first, nothing crazy, just the usual small talk and sharing the usual memes. I think we both like similar music and movies, so we had a few easy conversations. Nothing about him stood out as red flags. We started talking more, texting all the time, and eventually, he asked if I wanted to grab dinner. I agreed. I was pretty excited because, everything seemed fine up to that point. We decided to meet at a little bistro in the city. Nothing too fancy, just casual. I got there first, which I always do because I hate being late, and I found a table near the back. I had a good view of the door, so I sat back and checked my phone while I waited. I was actually feeling kind of good about the date. I'd gotten ready, put on a cute outfit that I thought suited me, and I felt confident. Then he walked in. I recognized him immediately, but the first thing that hit me was how different he looked from his pictures. Like, it wasn't that he was bad looking, but he didn't look like his profile. His photos were all taken from angles that made him look leaner and taller, but in person, he was shorter and stockier than I expected. And honestly, I didn't care. I've met guys who don't look exactly like their pictures, and it doesn't bother me. It's just one of those things. He came over and sat down across from me, and right away I could tell he was a little awkward, like he wasn't sure how to approach the conversation. I gave him a smile, trying to make it easy, and things started okay. We ordered drinks, chatted a bit about the usual work, life, the weather, but then things started to shift. It wasn't immediate, but after a few minutes, I started noticing that he was making these little comments about my appearance. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just small jabs. Like, the first one was about my hair. He mentioned that it looked a little flat that day, and I was like, okay, no big deal, whatever. But then it was my outfit. Apparently, the color I chose didn't really suit my complexion or wash me out of it. I didn't know what to say, but I tried to brush it off because maybe he was just nervous, right? But then the comments kept coming. It was like he was slowly building up to something. He made a remark about how the outfit's cute, but you could have maybe tried something a bit more figure flattering. I didn't know what to say. I liked what I was wearing. I felt good. But now, sitting there with his eyes scanning me like I was some kind of project, I started to doubt myself. It wasn't just the comments. It was the way he looked at me, like he was evaluating me for something. And then it happened. He said something about how my face was pretty, but could be better with a little more makeup. I could feel my face getting hot. What the hell? It was one of those moments where you don't really know how to react because you're just stunned. I don't wear a lot of makeup, but I've always felt comfortable with my natural look. And here he was, suggesting that it wasn't enough. I gave him a weak smile and tried to steer the conversation somewhere else, but he was relentless. Every time I said something, he'd find a way to bring it back to my appearance. He asked me what I did for fun, and I mentioned that I liked hiking. His response, "Oh, really? You don't really look like someone who enjoys that kind of thing." I tried to laugh it off, but I could feel myself getting more and more uncomfortable. It was like every little thing I said or did was being scrutinized. I was starting to wonder if he even liked me or if he was just there to pick me apart. At one point, I went to the bathroom to get a break from the weird energy. I stood in front of the mirror, taking a deep breath and trying to shake off the feeling that maybe something was off. I knew I wasn't perfect, but it felt like he was finding flaws I didn't even know existed. When I came back, he barely acknowledged me, just took a sip of his drink and stared at the menu like it was the most interesting thing in the world. That's when I realized this was probably the most awkward date I'd ever been on. And the worst part, I could feel myself getting self-conscious. It was like he made me question everything about myself in the span of an hour. I decided I needed to leave. I didn't want to sit through any more comments about how I looked, how I dressed, or how I could be better. So I told him I was going to head out. He seemed surprised, but not in the way you'd expect if someone were disappointed. It was more like he didn't really care. Honestly, I don't think he even realized how much he'd made me feel like crap. I didn't even want to finish my food. I just paid my part of the bill and left. As soon as I stepped out of that restaurant, I felt that I could breathe again. I thought maybe he would apologize or something, but instead I got a message from him later that night. It wasn't an apology, though. It was just him saying, you could really do something about your appearance. You'd get more attention if you made some changes. I deleted the message, and then I blocked him. It wasn't just the rude remarks, but the way he made me feel like I wasn't good enough unless I changed something about myself. And that, to me, was the most disturbing part of the whole date. I've never gone out with anyone who made me feel so small. It took me a while to shake off the feeling, but I realized that sometimes people just suck. And sometimes they don't deserve your time, energy, or any kind of validation. I don't really know what kind of person goes on dates just to tear someone else down, but I'm sure as hell not sticking around to find out. I thought I had it all figured out. Matched with Lena on Tinder, we hit it off immediately. We talked about everything: life, hobbies, our favorite shows, even weird childhood memories. It felt like we had some kind of unspoken connection. And after our first date, things only got better. We started texting nonstop, sharing memes, sending random thoughts. All the usual stuff that happens when things are going well. But then, things started to get weird. It started slow at first, just a few strange words here and there, like something I didn't remember saying. I thought maybe I'd accidentally sent a text and forgotten about it. It wasn't a big deal. But then the messages started to pile up, and they didn't make sense. I'd get random texts from her asking me how my day was going. I would reply, but then I'd get another text from her, seemingly out of nowhere, saying something like, "I hope your day's going well. I'm looking forward to tonight." But here's the thing: I hadn't texted her anything like that. I would look at my phone, and there'd be messages in the thread that I didn't remember reading. It wasn't just that the messages were strange, it was that they seemed out of order. It was like they didn't follow any kind of logic. I'd read one message, and then when I checked the thread, it would skip ahead to a message from me, something I hadn't sent yet. It freaked me out. I couldn't ignore it. I thought maybe I was just tired, or maybe it was some kind of weird glitch with the app. But over the next few days, it kept happening. The conversations didn't make sense, and I kept getting the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to ask Lena about it when we met up again. She seemed normal, at least at first. We hung out, talked, laughed, but something felt off. She was acting distant, not in a rude way, but like her mind wasn't entirely present. Like she was distracted by something, like she knew something I didn't. Then, as I was getting ready to leave, she dropped it. "You don't remember anything, do you?" she asked, just out of the blue. Her eyes were locked on mine, and there was something in her expression, almost like she was testing me. At first, I laughed it off, thinking maybe she was joking, but when she didn't smile, I started to feel uneasy. I tried to brush it off, but as I was walking out, I got a text from her. "I'll see you soon," it said. But here's the thing: I had already said goodbye and was already halfway down the hall. I checked the text, and there it was, like she had sent it in real time, but I hadn't even left her apartment yet. That's when the feeling of dread hit me. My stomach dropped. I went back to my apartment and immediately opened my phone, checking the conversation with Lena. I scrolled through it, trying to make sense of the strange messages I had been getting. And then it happened. I found something that made my blood run cold. I scrolled back through our conversation, and I saw messages I didn't remember. They were from her, but not the way they should have been. It was like she had been texting me from the future, from conversations we hadn't had yet. There were texts from her, talking to herself. In one message, she was telling me about something I hadn't experienced yet. In another, she was asking me how I felt about something we hadn't even discussed. I couldn't understand it. I was starting to panic. It was like I was going insane, or maybe I was just dreaming. But there were these messages I knew I hadn't read, let alone sent. The worst part: the way she talked in those texts wasn't how she talked in person. It was like she was different, more confident, almost like she knew exactly what was going to happen. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I tried to call her, but she didn't answer. I sent a few texts, asking if she knew what was going on, but she didn't respond. I sat there in my apartment, staring at the messages, trying to make sense of everything. Was I losing it? Was I somehow in a different timeline? How could she have known these things before they happened? The next day, I decided to go over to her place and get some answers. I couldn't let it go. I needed to know what was going on. When I arrived, she greeted me with that same distant look in her eyes, like she was waiting for me to figure something out. We sat down on our couch, and the tension between us was unbearable. I asked her straight up if she knew what was happening with the texts. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at me for a long moment. It was like she was waiting for me to understand something. Then she finally spoke, but her words made no sense. She told me that I had already been here, that we'd already had this conversation, that the texts were just one part of something bigger, something I couldn't yet understand. She said she had already seen everything play out before, but that I didn't remember it. I felt my heart race. What was she talking about? I tried to push her for more information, but she just smiled, almost like she was playing a game. The longer we sat there, the more uncomfortable I felt. My head was spinning. I could feel walls closing in on me. And then, before I even realized it, she was standing by the door as if to say goodbye. "I'll see you soon," she said, almost like she was saying it from the future, like she already knew what would happen next. I left her apartment, feeling like I had just stepped out of some weird, twisted dream. The whole experience was like a nightmare I couldn't escape from. I couldn't stop thinking about the strange conversations, the messages from the future. And then, just when I thought it was over, I got one final text from her. "I'm still watching." I blocked her number and deleted the app, but part of me still wonders if Lena knew something I didn't. Whether she was texting me from the future or from some other dimension, I don't know. All I know is I'll never forget that feeling of being watched, like someone knew every move I was going to make before I even made it. It was supposed to be the perfect Tinder date. Emily seemed like everything I'd ever wanted in a person. Beautiful, funny, smart, and we clicked instantly. Her profile was one of those that you just know is real. No weird photos, no overly staged stuff, just someone who seemed genuinely normal. We had a bunch of mutual interests, and our conversations were easy, like talking to an old friend. So when we finally agreed to meet up, I was excited. I didn't think I needed to overthink it. She seemed perfect, like someone I could actually see myself with. We met at a little cafe downtown, and she looked just like her photos, actually better. I remember thinking, wow, this could be something real. But as the conversation went on, there were little things that felt off. I couldn't really put my finger on it at first. She avoided talking about certain topics, like her past relationships or where she had grown up. She kind of shifted the conversation if it went in that direction, like she was dodging something. But I let it slide. Everyone has their reasons for keeping some things private, right? The night went fine. We laughed, had some coffee, I walked her back to her car. There was a moment at the end of the date when I tried to say something a little more personal, and she shut it down quickly. A little too quickly. I figured I was just overthinking things, but that feeling stuck with me, like I was missing something important. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Something wasn't sitting right, but I still didn't want to be paranoid or weird about it. She was perfect in every way, so it probably wasn't anything to worry about. But that night, I decided to do something stupid. I Googled her. You know how you get a name and just have this weird itch to dig a little deeper. Yeah, I shouldn't have done that. I found another profile of hers on a different app, not Tinder. It was under a completely different name. I stared at the screen for what felt like forever. The profile picture was the same, but everything else was different. Her bio was different, and the details about her life were nothing like the stuff she had told me. This profile was under the name Mia and had a totally different set of photos. I'm not even sure how to describe it. There was a slight difference, like it wasn't the same person, but it was. My stomach dropped. I clicked through the photos, wondering if maybe it was just a weird coincidence, but deep down I knew it wasn't. There was something about her smile, her eyes. They were exactly the same, but everything else didn't make sense. It was like a completely different person, but at the same time, it was unmistakably Emily. I sat there for what felt like forever, trying to wrap my head around it. How could she have another profile, and why a different name? I decided to confront her. Maybe it was dumb, but I couldn't just ignore it. I shot her a message on Tinder asking her about the second profile. Almost immediately, she replied. She sounded completely confused. She told me it wasn't her, that someone must have been using her pictures. But it didn't add up. The pictures were so specific, and the details lined up with everything she told me. It didn't make sense. I kept trying to dig deeper, asking questions. She kept acting like I was crazy for even bringing it up. Her responses were dismissive, like she was brushing me off. I told her I wasn't buying it, that it was too strange to be a coincidence. She didn't like that. The conversation ended there, but something about her response left me uneasy. It wasn't even about the profile itself. It was the way she acted. I was starting to feel like I wasn't just talking to someone who was hiding something. This felt more like I was talking to someone who wasn't being entirely truthful about who they were. Later that night, after everything had calmed down, I got a message from her. It wasn't a big deal at first, just another text checking in, asking how my day was going. But then, at the end of the message, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It said, "You shouldn't have found out." I froze. My mind immediately started racing. What did that even mean? Was I just overreacting to everything, or was she trying to tell me something? I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something much darker. I didn't respond to the message. Instead, I just stared at my phone, my heart pounding. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept going over everything. The weird way she dodged certain topics on our date, the strange second profile, the text at the end of the conversation. Nothing made sense. I kept thinking about it, and the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. I tried to reach out to some of my friends, but I didn't even know how to explain it. They'd think I was overreacting. They'd tell me I was just getting too invested too quickly, and maybe I was. But this wasn't just an overreaction. It felt like there was something else going on with her, something I wasn't supposed to find out. The next day, I decided to block her. I didn't want to be in the middle of some weird cat and mouse game. I thought maybe it would be better if I just cut all ties with her before things got any stranger. I blocked her on Tinder, deleted the messages, and tried to move on. But the thing is, every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing her face. I kept hearing that text in my head. You shouldn't have found out. And that's the last thing she said to me. Maybe I should have ignored it all, but there was no going back after that. She wasn't who I thought she was. And I don't know what her deal was. I can't shake the feeling that I've only seen a small part of the story. Maybe Lena or Mia is the real person. Maybe Emily is the fake name, or maybe they're both just masks she wears, hiding who she really is. Either way, I'm not planning on finding out anytime soon. I'm not one to jump to conclusions or get paranoid, but after my date with Charlie, I had to ask myself if I'd been too trusting. It all started out fine, too. We matched on Tinder, and the conversation was light and easy. He seemed like a genuinely cool guy, funny, into the same stuff as me, and honestly, he looked great in his pictures. No weird angles, no staged photos. We hit it off right away. Our date was low-key, just grabbing coffee at this cute little cafe downtown. It wasn't one of those I'm trying too hard dates. It felt normal. We talked about everything, our favorite movies, places we wanted to travel, silly things we'd done in our past. He was charming, smart, and I was actually starting to think I could see this going somewhere. But as the night went on, there was one thing I noticed that didn't sit well with me. Charlie kept staring at me, not in a creepy way, but in a way that felt like he was studying me. Like it was some sort of puzzle he was trying to figure out. At first, I shrugged it off. Maybe he was just trying to make a good impression or something, right? But then he said something strange. He told me that I looked just like someone he knew. At first, I thought it was a compliment. He said I looked just like his cousin, and that was kind of odd, but whatever. It wasn't the first time someone had compared me to someone else. But then he got a little more specific. He mentioned how his cousin had gone missing about a year ago. I didn't know what to make of it, but he said it so casually, like it was nothing. I just laughed it off, thinking he was joking or trying to get me to feel sorry for him. Maybe he was one of those people who thought saying weird things made him sound mysterious, or maybe he thought it was a funny icebreaker. I didn't want to read too much into it. But that night, when I got home and was lying in bed, I got a text from him. It was a picture of a woman, maybe in her late 20s, with blonde hair and strikingly similar features to mine. It took me a second to recognize it, but it was a photo of the cousin he'd mentioned earlier. He didn't just send it out of the blue, though. He added a message with it. You look just like her. Too bad she went missing. I stared at the message, my stomach dropping. It felt wrong. I mean, who says something like that? Who sends a picture of a missing person they know? It was unsettling, and I immediately felt that sickening twist in my gut, the kind you get when you sense something is off, but can't quite explain why. I thought maybe he was trying to make a joke. Maybe he thought it'd be funny or something. But it wasn't funny. It wasn't even close. I didn't even respond to it. I just blocked him. I figured that would be the end of it. But the next day, I woke up to another message from him. At first, I thought it was just him texting like nothing had happened, but then I saw it. The message itself wasn't anything out of the ordinary, just as simple, "Hey, I hope you're doing well today." I almost ignored it, but something in my gut told me to scroll up and check his last text again. That's when my heart nearly stopped. In the thread, right above his latest message, was a text I hadn't noticed before. I must have missed it the night before, but now that I saw it, it made my blood run cold. You are her. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt this wave of panic hit me, and for the first time, I truly started questioning everything. I'd been careful. I hadn't shared too much personal stuff with him. He didn't even know where I lived or anything that would make sense for him to say that. And yet, here I was staring at a message that felt threatening. I blocked him again and deleted everything. I didn't want to deal with this, didn't want to get tangled up in whatever mind games he was playing. I convinced myself that I was just overreacting, that maybe I was reading too much into it. But the truth is, something inside me just knew that this wasn't a coincidence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the photo he'd sent the missing cousin. I Googled her name and found a few articles, but nothing concrete. It was like she disappeared off the face of the earth. No updates, no new leads. The only thing that came up were a few Facebook posts about her, all dated a year ago, talking about her disappearance. But as I scrolled through the pages, I noticed something strange: her face. It was too similar to mine. Not just the blonde hair or the same smile. It was almost like they'd been taken the same angle in similar lighting. And as I looked closer, I saw it. The same dimples I had. The same nose. The same eyes. I don't know if I could have seen the similarities if I hadn't been so shaken by Charlie's text, but at that moment, everything just seemed to click in a way that terrified me. I didn't hear from him again. Not after that. I thought I was safe, that I had made the right decision blocking him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't over. What did he mean by "you are her"? Was it just a messed up coincidence, or had he known something I didn't? And if he really did know something about me, how long had he been watching me? How did he even find me in the first place? All I know is that something about this entire situation doesn't add up, and every time I think about it, I get that sinking feeling that I've only scratched the surface. I don't want to go back and try to figure out what happened to his cousin. I'm not ready to dive into that mess, but I won't ever forget the way he made me feel, the way he seemed to know things about me I hadn't told him, and the fact that I'm still not entirely sure if I've heard the last of Charlie. So, I don't know if I've just been unlucky with Tinder, but this one date with Sam really freaked me out. Everything seemed totally normal at first, but when I look back, I realized how strange things were from the start. Honestly, I thought I was just overthinking it at the time, but after what happened, I can't shake the feeling that something was definitely off. We matched on Tinder, and he seemed pretty chill. His profile was cute, with a couple of outdoor pics and some funny, sarcastic one-liners in his bio. I liked his vibe. We texted back and forth for a bit, and then he suggested grabbing drinks. Seemed like a good idea to me. I was pretty excited, to be honest. We set up a time for him to pick me up, and everything was fine until I actually got in his car. The first thing that hit me was the silence. He didn't say a word when I got in. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he was shy or just focused on driving. But then, as we started driving toward the bar, I tried to make small talk. I asked him how his day had been, if he'd been to this bar before, stuff like that. He just nodded or mumbled in response, barely making eye contact. It was like I was talking to a wall. I don't know if you've ever been in a car with someone who's giving off that kind of vibe, but it's uncomfortable as hell. I kept trying to engage in conversation, but it just felt awkward. Like I was annoying him, even though he'd been the one who suggested the date in the first place. I started wondering if I'd said something wrong, but then I remembered that I hadn't even said much. So why was he acting like this? When we finally arrived at the bar, I was relieved just to get out of the car. I thought, okay, maybe he just needs to loosen up. But it wasn't much better once we were inside. He was still pretty quiet. I ordered a drink, and he ordered one for me before I even had the chance to ask for what I wanted. Not a huge deal, but it definitely felt a little weird. How did he know I liked that particular drink? It's a small thing, but it was starting to feel like he'd been watching me, like he already knew everything about me. I sat down trying to push past the weirdness. I figured I could give him some time to warm up. But then, as we were talking, or, as I was talking and he was mostly nodding and occasionally mumbling, I glanced down and saw his phone on the table. It was face up, and I'd noticed that Tinder was still open on it. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then I realized something that made my stomach drop. He'd already matched with me. It wasn't just that we'd already connected on the app, it was the fact that his profile was still open, and he clearly swiped on me before our date. But why would he still have his profile open while we were sitting there together? I thought about it for a second. Then it hit me. He'd been talking to me on Tinder before we even met. But that's not what made me freeze. What made me freeze was the fact that he had already matched with me again. It wasn't like he was swiping randomly. He was matching with me again while we were sitting across from each other in real life. I stared at the phone for a second, unsure of what to do. I didn't want to seem like a weirdo, but I couldn't stop looking at the screen. I couldn't stop wondering, how long had he been keeping me in his matches? How many other girls had he matched with like this? Why didn't he just swipe left if he didn't want to talk to me? I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't. Eventually, I asked him about it. I was half joking when I said, "So, why do you still have your Tinder open? Don't you think you should close it or at least hide it when you're on a date with someone?" He just smiled at me, and it was the weirdest, creepiest smile I'd ever seen. It was almost like a smirk, but something about it didn't sit right, like he knew something I didn't, like he was in on a joke that I hadn't heard. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "You were always going to say yes." I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking or maybe just trying to be funny in that weird way some guys do. But I didn't laugh much after that. The silence between us was thick, and I could feel the tension rising. It wasn't just awkward anymore. It felt like something more. I don't know how to describe it, but it was like he wasn't just here to get to know me. Like he was here for something else. The rest of the night went by in a blur. I kept trying to make conversation, but I couldn't shake that weird feeling. I tried to focus on the drinks, on the music, on anything to distract myself. But it was like I was in a haze. He was so quiet, and when I did manage to get a few words out of him, they didn't add up. He didn't ask me any questions. He didn't seem interested in anything about me, except for things he already knew. It felt like we were just going through the motions, like I was some character in a story he was playing out. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I made some excuse about needing to leave and went to grab my jacket. He didn't try to stop me. He just sat there, watching me. It was like he was waiting for me to leave, like he'd known all along I would. When I left the bar and got into my car, I immediately blocked him on Tinder. I didn't know what else to do. I felt shaken up, like I had just had a close encounter with something off. Since then, I've tried to forget about it, but every now and then, I catch myself thinking about that smile of his and those words. "You were always going to say yes," and every time, I get this feeling in my gut that I've dodged a bullet. I still don't know what he meant by that. What the hell did he know about me? Why was he acting like we had already been through this before? I guess I'll never know, but I'm definitely done with Tinder. Okay, this happened a few months ago, and honestly, I still don't know what to make of it. I'm trying to forget it, but every time I close my eyes, I can still picture the place. It was like something straight out of a horror movie. I still feel unease when I think back to it. I wish I had trusted my gut from the start. So I matched with Greg on Tinder, and we hit it off pretty quickly. We exchanged a ton of messages, and everything seemed fine. He seemed normal, or at least as normal as anyone can seem online. We had similar tastes, joked around a lot, and talked about meeting up. After a few days of texting, he suggested I come over to his place. I wasn't sure at first, but he seemed genuine, and I figured it'd be fun to finally meet. He gave me the address, nothing crazy, just the usual, it's in a pretty chill area kind of thing. He even sent me a pin on Google Maps, and it seemed legit. Honestly, I was looking forward to it. I thought it was going to be like any other casual meetup, just a couple of drinks and some good conversation. But what I didn't expect was that when I showed up, things were not what they seemed. I drove out to the address he gave me, and it didn't take too long to get there. But when I turned onto the street, I immediately felt a knot in my stomach. The place was on the outskirts of town, a quiet, almost desolate area. The streetlights barely lit up, and everything looked run down. But hey, I thought maybe he's just in a secluded part of town. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid. Then I saw it. It wasn't a house like I expected. It was a huge abandoned building. The windows were shattered, and there was graffiti all over the walls. The whole place looked like it had been deserted for years. My heart started pounding, and I took a deep breath, thinking, this can't be right. But I texted Greg anyway, asking if he was sure I was at the right place. I wasn't about to get out of the car yet, not in a place like this. He responded almost instantly. "I'm waiting inside." I stared at my phone for a second, trying to make sense of it. Inside? Inside a rundown, abandoned building. That didn't sound like someone's house. I told myself maybe it was some kind of weird joke or miscommunication, but it wasn't funny. I'm not an idiot, so I sat there for a minute debating whether or not to just turn around and leave. Something about this felt so wrong. But, curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't just drive off after coming all this way. I figured maybe I was overthinking things. It's not like I was trapped in the place. I could always just leave, right? I texted Greg back, telling him I was outside and asking for clarification. But by then, I had already made up my mind. I would at least go inside for a minute, see what was up, and then leave if it seemed sketchy. I grabbed my stuff and made my way toward the door, my footsteps echoing in the silence of the street. The door was half open, and there was this unsettling smell of mold and dust. The place was dark, but I could just make out a few broken light fixtures on the ceiling, and there was a dim glow from the outside streetlights filtering through the cracks. The second I stepped inside, something felt wrong. My mind was racing with all the worst-case scenarios, but I kept pushing those thoughts aside. I reminded myself that Greg was supposed to be inside, and I was just being dramatic, but when I heard footsteps behind me, I froze. I spun around, my heart in my throat, expecting to see him walking toward me, but there was nothing. The space was empty. No one. My mind was racing. Was it just my imagination? I took a shaky breath and checked my phone. Nothing had changed on the screen except for the new message from Greg. "You're already here. I've been waiting for you a long time." I stared at the message, feeling my blood run cold. What the hell? I didn't even know what to think. I looked around the dark hallway, my eyes darting between the broken walls and the fading light. It was silent. Too silent. I tried to shake off the feeling that was crawling up my spine, but it only got worse the longer I stood there. I didn't hear him approach. I didn't hear anything. It felt like I was alone, but I couldn't be sure. I stepped back toward the door, my fingers brushing the door frame as I tried to open it. It was stuck, like it had been jammed from the other side. Panic started to rise in my chest as I struggled with the handle. My mind was racing with worst-case scenarios. What if he was already inside? What if he was watching me right now? I didn't know what the hell to do. My phone buzzed again, and I looked at it, half expecting it to be another weird message. But this one was different. It was a new text from Greg, except it was weird. There was no punctuation, no greeting, just 2 words: "Don't leave." I didn't even read the rest of it. I couldn't. I bolted. I shoved the door open with all my strength, heart racing as I ran back outside, not caring about anything but getting out of that building. I don't know how fast I ran, but I didn't stop until I was back in my car. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, and I didn't even look back at the building. I just drove straight home, trying to keep it together. The weird thing, after I got home, I blocked Greg. He never texted me again, never called. But somehow I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watching me the whole time. Like he knew what I was doing every second I was in that building. Maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe it was just some messed up prank, but I don't think I'll ever really know. One thing's for sure, I won't be meeting anyone from Tinder at an abandoned building again. Alright, I still don't know what to make of this, but I feel like I need to share it because it's the kind of thing that messes with your head. Like, for real, it's been haunting me for weeks, and I can't shake it off. This isn't something that just happens in horror movies, but it felt like one. Here's how it went down. I matched with Chris on Tinder a few weeks ago. At first, he seemed like just another guy on there, but we really hit it off. We were chatting constantly, sending memes, talking about our favorite shows and movies, and we had a lot of common interests. It wasn't one of those awkward small talk things that you sometimes get when you're dating online. It felt easy. So easy, in fact, that after a couple of days of texting, we decided to meet in person. Our first date was perfect. We went to a little cafe downtown, grabbed some coffee, talked for hours, and by the end of it, I was thinking, yeah, this guy could be someone I could get to know better. He was funny, charming, and just seemed like a genuinely sweet person. We hugged goodbye, and he texted me as soon as I got home to say how much he enjoyed our time together. I was feeling good, honestly. A couple of days passed, and we kept texting. Nothing weird, just the usual stuff. But then things started to get strange. One evening, I was lounging on my couch, watching Netflix, when I got a random text from an unknown number. I didn't recognize it, but I opened it anyway. It was a picture of me. I stared at the phone screen, my heart dropping. The image was of me, clearly taken from the side of my living room. I was lying on the couch in my pajamas, completely asleep. The angle of the photo was strange, though. It wasn't like someone was sitting on the other side of the room, taking a casual picture. It was more like the person had been right there with me, close enough to see everything. I didn't remember anyone being in my apartment. I didn't remember taking a nap there either. It all felt so off, and I was immediately flooded with confusion and panic. My first thought was that maybe one of my friends had pranked me, but none of them had access to my place. I lived alone, and there was no way anyone could have taken that picture without me noticing. I tried to keep my cool, but I couldn't. I texted back asking, "What is this? Why did you send me this?" It was like my fingers were moving on their own, typing out the words before I could even think about it. The reply came almost instantly. "This is me, Chris. I just want you to have this." That's it. That was all the response said. No explanation, no context, just the picture and those words. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, my mind racing. At first, I didn't want to believe it. I told myself it had to be some weird mistake or a glitch. Maybe it was an old photo he hadn't sent it by accident. But the more I looked at it, the more I knew deep down that it wasn't a mistake. I wasn't in the mood to jump to conclusions, but I had to know what was going on, so I texted him again. "What does that mean? How did you get that photo?" His response came even quicker this time. "I've been watching you for a while. I hope you like the picture." I don't know what I felt in that moment. Confusion, anger, fear. It all mixed together. How could this guy, who I had met on Tinder just a few days ago, send me something like this? Watching me. What did he mean by that? My head was spinning. I tried calling him, but he didn't pick up. I called again. No answer. At that point, my instincts were screaming at me to block him, to just forget everything and shut it all down. But I couldn't. I needed answers. I needed to know if this was some sick joke or something else entirely. I decided to take a step back and think. Maybe I could just ignore it and move on, but that feeling of being watched was already crawling under my skin. I looked around my apartment, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. I was alone. I had nothing to worry about. But then I started thinking about everything, how we'd been talking for days, how he knew where I lived, how he even knew what I looked like when I was asleep. That's when it hit me. This wasn't some weird misunderstanding. This was someone who had been watching me, and he wasn't just taking random pictures. He was getting close enough to know the exact angle to capture me while I was vulnerable. The next few hours were a blur. I tried to distract myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. It felt like my own apartment wasn't even safe anymore. Every time I moved, I thought I saw something in the corner of my eye. It wasn't just the picture. It was everything that had been happening before, all the little signs that now seemed so obvious. Finally, I blocked him. I couldn't deal with it anymore. I thought if I just erased him from my phone, it would all stop. But when I woke up the next morning, there was a new message from an unknown number. My heart sank. It was from Chris again, even though I had blocked him. It read, "You can't hide from me. I'll always be watching." That was the last straw. I didn't want to take any chances, so I immediately called the police. I didn't know if they could do anything, but I had to report it. I changed all my privacy settings, made sure my social media accounts were locked down, and I even got a new phone number. I wasn't taking any risks. The worst part, I never heard from Chris again after that message. He completely vanished, as if he'd never existed in the first place. I couldn't find any trace of him online. His Tinder profile disappeared, and his number was disconnected. But even now, I still get nervous every time I see a random number pop up on my phone. I keep thinking he's still out there watching me. I don't know if he ever really went away. And I don't think I'll ever be able to feel completely safe in my own space again. Okay, I'm still not sure what to make of this whole situation, but it's been bugging me for a while now. I guess I need to get it out there. It all started a few weeks ago when I matched with Fred on Tinder. From the get-go, he seemed like a pretty normal guy, although there was something off about him that I couldn't quite put my finger on. He was super polite, funny, and had the kind of charm that made you think he'd be good company. His pictures were a little basic, but that was fine. I'm not picky, and he was nice to talk to. After chatting for a couple of days, he asked if I wanted to meet up. We decided on a coffee shop downtown, the kind of low-key spot where you can just sit and talk for hours without anyone bothering you. Honestly, I was excited. We'd been texting pretty consistently, and I felt like there was a real connection, even if it was just through messages. I had dates before that seemed great online, only to find out in person that things don't always click. But Fred felt different, or so I thought. The day of the date, I was a little nervous. I mean, you never really know how someone's going to be in real life, especially after just texting for a while. So I showed up at the coffee shop a little early, hoping I wouldn't come off too eager, but also because I was curious about how this would go. When I saw him walk through the door, I recognized him right away, even though he looked a bit more nervous than his photos showed. He was wearing a plain hoodie and jeans, nothing fancy, which I thought was cool since I'm not a fan of overdressed guys anyway. But something about his body language was odd. He kept his head down and shoulders hunched. It was like he was trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable. I waved it in from across the room, and he smiled nervously. But as he came closer, I noticed he was walking strangely, like he was trying to make his movements as minimal as possible. When he sat down, he kept adjusting his sleeves and tapping his fingers on the table. It was uncomfortable, to be honest. I tried to keep things light and asked him about his day, but he barely responded. It was like pulling teeth just to get a full sentence out of him. I wasn't sure if he was shy or if he just wasn't into the date, but I could tell he was anxious, like way more anxious than anyone should be on a first date. I figured it was just a case of first date jitters. We all have them, right? So I tried to break the ice by telling him a funny story about how I'd spilled coffee on my lap earlier that day. I know, super smooth. That got a little laugh out of him, which helped, but his nervous energy didn't seem to go away. At this point, I started to feel bad for him, like maybe I was being too harsh in my judgment. People get nervous. I get it. After about an hour of awkward conversation, I decided to end it. I wasn't feeling a spark, and it seemed like Fred was just way too uncomfortable to enjoy himself. But when I stood up to leave, he suddenly got up too. I wasn't expecting him to follow me out, but I guess he was trying to be polite. He offered me a hug. Now, I'm not big on hugging people I barely know, but he seemed so sweet, so I thought, why not? I swear, the second our bodies touched, I felt something weird. At first, I thought it was just me being overly sensitive or something, but it was like a heavy dampness on his chest. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as I pulled back, I realized what had happened. He had wet his pants, like a lot. I could feel the warmth seeping through his hoodie down to my arms. It wasn't just a little accident, it was a full-on wetting. I froze, not knowing what to say or do. Fred just stood there, face bright red, avoiding eye contact. I felt so bad for him. I mean, who expects to have that kind of thing happen on a date? I tried to laugh it off because, honestly, what else could I do? But he didn't say anything, just shuffled away awkwardly, mumbling something about needing to go home. I couldn't help but feel terrible for him. I mean, that's a pretty intense thing to happen on a first date, right? I didn't know if I should follow up with a text or just let it go, so I chose to send a quick message later that evening, just saying, "Hey, I hope you're okay. If you need to talk or whatever, I'm here." I honestly didn't know what else to say. I wasn't trying to make fun of him or anything. That situation was just, well, really uncomfortable and a little strange. But then things took a turn that I didn't expect. The next day, I woke up to a message from Fred. I thought it was going to be an apology or an explanation, but it wasn't. Instead, it was just a short, weird text. "I don't think you're ready for what comes next." I stared at the screen for what felt like forever. I thought about asking him what that meant, but then I got this awful feeling in the pit of my stomach. Like maybe I had just stepped into something I wasn't supposed to. I decided to ignore it, thinking it might have been a weird thing to say in the heat of the moment. But then, a couple of days later, he messaged me again. This time, it was a picture. It wasn't anything weird at first glance, just a photo of a street, some blurry buildings. But when I looked closer, I realized something. It was taken outside my apartment. From the angle, it looked like someone had taken it from a distance, maybe from across the street. My heart started racing. I didn't know if I was overreacting, but I immediately blocked him. I didn't want anything to do with this. But the weird part, he didn't stop. I kept getting messages from him, from different numbers, saying strange things like, "You don't know me, but I'm watching you. I know everything about you." After a few more of these, I just deleted the app altogether. I didn't want to risk anything. I heard of people being stopped through Tinder, but I didn't think it happened to me. Now, every time I walk outside or even check my phone, I feel like someone's watching me. I don't know what happened with Frey after that, but I'm not sure I want to know. Sometimes I wonder if I should have just stayed home that day and not gone to that stupid coffee shop. If I had, maybe I wouldn't be looking over my shoulder every time I leave the house. So I still can't shake off the feeling from that night. I matched with Lena on Tinder a few weeks ago, and we hit it off pretty fast. She was cool, funny, and seemed genuinely into getting to know me. She had this vibe about her, laid back but also a little mysterious. After chatting for a while, she invited me over to her apartment for drinks. Honestly, I didn't think much of it. I mean, it's not like we hadn't been talking for days. Things felt fine, and she wasn't sketchy or anything. Or at least I didn't think so. When I got to her place, it was in this older building near the city center. The kind that looked nice enough from the outside. But when you stepped in, it felt like something was missing, like it was just a little too quiet. Not a huge deal, I guessed, but I noticed it right away. She buzzed me in, and I took the elevator out to her floor. The hallways were dark, and there was this weird smell like old carpet and maybe a little mildew, but it wasn't overpowering. It was just enough to make me raise an eyebrow, but again, I wasn't about to judge her based on that. Her apartment was cute. It had a cozy vibe to it. She had a lot of plants, and the walls were full of pictures and artwork. I thought, okay, this is nice. She offered me a drink, and we sat down on the couch. The conversation started off great, but there was this underlying weirdness I couldn't ignore. Lena kept glancing at her phone, which was strange since we were supposed to be hanging out. Every time she'd look at it, her expression would change, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. Maybe I was just overthinking it, but it made me a little uncomfortable. A few drinks in, I excused myself to use the bathroom. She pointed me down the hallway and said, "It's the second door on the left." I nodded and made my way down the hall. The moment I stepped into the bathroom, something felt off. It was small, nothing special, but something about it felt too normal. Does that make sense? Like it was too clean, too tidy. It was one of those bathrooms where everything's placed perfectly, and it almost felt like it wasn't actually used by anyone. As I was standing there, minding my own business, I noticed something strange in the ceiling vent. There was this small black hole in the metal grate. At first, I thought it was just some dirt or dust or whatever, but then my eyes lingered on it a little too long, and that's when I realized it wasn't dust. It was a small camera lens staring right back at me. I froze. My mind raced. I blinked a couple of times, thinking I was seeing things. But nope, it was definitely a camera. Not a big one, but just small enough to blend into the vent. It was positioned perfectly to get a clear view of the entire bathroom. My stomach dropped. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't believe it. Was I being paranoid? Maybe. But at that moment, I knew I wasn't imagining things. I didn't want to panic and make a scene, so I quietly finished up what I was doing, washed my hands, and tried to act as casual as possible when I went back to the living room. But my mind was spinning, and I couldn't focus on anything Lena was saying. I tried to shake it off and just enjoy the night, but I couldn't stop thinking about the camera. The more I thought about it, the worse it seemed. Who the hell would put a camera in their bathroom? And why the hell would they put it in the vent? Was she watching me, or had she been watching other people too? My skin crawled at the thought. I tried to act normal, but I felt I was being watched, like everything I did was being analyzed. A couple of minutes later, Lena stood up to get more drinks, and I saw my opportunity. I slipped into the hallway, trying to be as quiet as possible, and walked straight to the bathroom again. I checked the vent once more. I don't know what I expected to see, but the camera was still there, hidden in the vent just like before. I wanted to take a picture of it or record a video to prove it, but I was too scared. I didn't know what Lena might do if she caught me snooping around, so I did the next best thing. I looked around the bathroom. Maybe there was something else, something more obvious. I wanted to find anything that could explain why the hell there was a camera aimed directly at me. Nothing. Just a normal bathroom, except for that damn camera. I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay in that apartment, not knowing what was going on. I wasn't about to confront her either. I didn't know what kind of person she really was. I wasn't about to give her the chance to explain herself. I felt like if I stayed any longer, I was just digging myself into a deeper hole. I quickly made my way back to the living room and grabbed my jacket, trying to act casual. Lena was at the kitchen counter pouring another drink, but she didn't notice me slipping out of the apartment. I didn't care anymore. I had to leave. The second I stepped out of the building, I felt like I could breathe again. The cool air hit me, and I immediately called a cab to get as far away as possible. The whole ride home, I kept thinking about the camera, about everything. I couldn't believe I had missed the signs earlier. Maybe I was just too trusting, too naive. I should have known something was off when she was acting weird, but I didn't. When I got home, I checked my phone to see if she had texted me. I wanted to be sure I wasn't overreacting. I thought maybe I'd just blow it off as paranoia and maybe apologize if I'd been too weird. But then I saw something that made my stomach turn. Lita had sent me a text. I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable earlier. The camera in the vent is just for security purposes. Just wanted to make sure you were safe. Hope you're not mad. I couldn't breathe for a second. My heart started racing again, and I felt I was going to lose it. Why the hell would she have a camera in her bathroom? And why was she telling me it was for my safety? I blocked her immediately. I didn't care if I was overreacting. I had seen enough. I didn't need to know more. It's been a few weeks now, and I still don't understand it. I haven't heard from Lena since then, and I don't want to. I don't want to know what kind of twisted things she might have been doing with that camera. But I do know one thing. After that night, I'm definitely a lot more careful about who I meet up with. I don't think I'll ever be able to forget the feeling of being watched, and I'll never trust someone that easily again. I'll never forget that night. It started out like any other date, just a regular meetup after chatting for a few days. But what happened with Maggie was, well, it was anything but ordinary. I'd matched with Maggie on Tinder about a week ago. We hit it off right away. She was sweet, a little shy, but easy to talk to. She had that kind of quiet charm, and we ended up chatting for hours. We both liked the same kind of music, had similar taste in movies, and both agreed that Sunday mornings were meant for sleeping in. She told me she wasn't the type to go out much, but after a few days of texting back and forth, she agreed to meet me at a bar downtown for drinks. It seemed like a good idea. Nothing crazy, just a low-key first date. When I arrived at the bar, I was excited. I had already been imagining the date in my head. We'd laugh, have a couple of drinks, maybe even talk about random stuff until the night faded out. When I saw her walking toward me, I could tell something was off. Maggie looked strange, not in I just woke up and wearing sweatpants kind of way, but in a way that was hard to put my finger on. She was wearing a nice dress, but her posture was stiff. Her eyes kept darting around the room like she was looking for something, or maybe avoiding something. The moment she sat down, she didn't really look at me. She just kept glancing around, almost like she was scanning the room. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe she was just nervous. After all, first dates can be awkward, right? So I smiled, tried to make a joke about the weather, something to break the ice. But she barely smiled back. She just gave a small nod and muttered something like, yeah, it's been weird lately, huh? Okay, I thought, maybe she's just shy. It happens. I've been on plenty of dates where the conversation didn't really pick up at first. But as the minutes ticked by, it got more and more uncomfortable. She wasn't really making eye contact anymore. Instead, her gaze would drift to the table, or sometimes to the ceiling, like she was looking at something that wasn't there. I tried again. So, tell me about your week. Anything exciting happen? She answered with a short, not really, and then the awkward silence settled in again. It was one of those lulls where neither of us knew what to say, but both of us were trying to think of something to fill the space. I could feel myself starting to get anxious. I hated that feeling. Then I asked her, is something wrong? You seem kind of off tonight. She looked at me, and I could swear there was a brief flicker of confusion in her eyes. For a second, it was like she didn't even recognize the question. It felt wrong, but I shrugged it off, figuring I had just caught her off guard. So I repeated myself, trying to sound casual. What do you mean? She asked, her tone flat, almost robotic. At that moment, my stomach dropped. The way she said it wasn't just a simple question. It was like she genuinely didn't know what I was talking about. I mean, I had just asked her a pretty straightforward question, right? Why wouldn't she remember? I felt my heart rate pick up a little, and I tried to laugh it off. Maybe she was messing with me, right? It seemed like a strange joke, but I figured I might have misunderstood something. I wanted to believe that. But then I asked the same question again, just to see how she'd respond. I just mean, you seem a little distant. Is everything okay? Again, she gave me that same blank stare. What do you mean? Okay, now it was definitely uncomfortable. I didn't know what was going on, but I could feel that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the weird responses. There was a strange, almost eerie vibe around her. She wasn't responding like a normal person would. I kept staring at her, trying to process what was happening. My mind raced, jumping from one possibility to the next. Could she be drunk? High. Maybe she was having some kind of anxiety episode. But even then, something still felt off. I was about to ask if she was okay when she suddenly stood up. It wasn't a smooth, casual stand either. It was like she just jolted out of her seat, as if something snapped inside her. She looked around the bar for a second, then quickly turned and walked towards the door. She didn't say goodbye. No. It was nice meeting you. No. I'll text you later. Just nothing. I sat there for a moment, staring at the spot where she had been sitting. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what just happened. I was pretty sure I hadn't just imagined the whole thing. She had acted weird, like she wasn't herself. But why? Was she avoiding me, or was something else going on? I pulled out my phone and shot her a quick text, asking if she was okay, but I didn't get a reply. I figured maybe she just had to leave, or she wasn't in the right headspace, but the whole situation felt off. I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was just having a bad night. But that didn't explain the way she had reacted to my question, or the way she seemed so distant, like she was in some kind of trance. I sat at the bar for a little while longer, nursing my drink, trying to process everything. The more I thought about it, the weirder it seemed. Had I imagined it? Was I overthinking things? But no, everything had happened so fast, and everything about her was just wrong. I checked my phone again, but still no text from her. It wasn't like her to just leave like that, especially after what seemed like a perfectly normal conversation. Something didn't sit right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The next morning, I woke up and decided to send one last text to see if she was okay. Maybe she had just been overwhelmed or having a bad day. But when I opened the app, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Maggie had deleted her Tinder profile. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know if I had just experienced a weird, unsettling date, or if I had been part of something I didn't fully understand. Either way, I was left with this strange, nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. I never heard from Maggie again, and to be honest, I'm not sure I ever want to. What happened that night is still a mystery to me. But every now and then when I think about it, I can't help but wonder if I was talking to the real Maggie or if something else, something darker, was behind that strange encounter.